this week. Late last night, the president-elect announcing Tom Homan, his former acting director of ICE, as his new border czar. Homan was an early proponent of the first Trump administration's controversial family separation policy. Now, Homan has said the new mass deportation plan would be, quote, well-targeted. Here he is this morning on Fox News.
President Trump is going to secure this border. He's going to save American lives. He's going to, by securing the border, we're going to drop illegal alien crime, which is skyrocketing.
Yep.
Less people are going to die from fentanyl. Less children are going to be sex trafficked. Less women will be sex assaulted on the southern border. The criminal cartels will be put out of business by this president.
Now, in addition to installing Homan, Trump is also expected to bring another loyalist and immigration hardliner into his inner circle, Stephen Miller. That's as his deputy chief of staff for policy. That's according to a source with knowledge of the Trump transition team's plans. Now, both Homan and Miller will likely be central players in potential roundups of illegal immigrants, a plan that Trump made a cornerstone of his campaign.
On day one, I will launch the largest deportation program in American history. I will rescue every city and town that has been invaded and conquered.
Now, the president-elect also announcing a top congressional ally, New York's Elise Stefanik, as his pick to be the next UN ambassador. And within the last hour or so, he's also announced he's choosing former New York Congressman Lee Zeldin to lead the EPA. Now, we expect to learn more about who else will fill key roles in the coming days, including critical national security and defense roles. Two sources telling NBC News that a controversial Trump loyalist, Kash Patel, is under consideration to take over the CIA or the FBI. When Trump tried to install Patel in the CIA during his first term, the head of the agency at the time threatened to resign in protest. Now, all of this comes as NBC News now projects Mr. Trump will sweep all 7 battleground states. That's after NBC News called Arizona in his favor over the weekend. That final call giving Trump 312 electoral votes in his decisive presidential race victory. I'm joined now by Garrett Hake, who covered the Trump campaign and is now covering the Trump transition. Also with me, NBC News Homeland Security correspondent Julia Ainsley and our Justice and Intelligence correspondent Ken Delanian as well. Garrett, I'll start with you here. Every appointment so far, other than Elise Stefanik, is someone who served in the first Trump administration. What do you make of that at this point? He's surrounding himself with familiar faces, familiar voices, familiar views.
Well, Lee Zeldin was a big ally on the Hill during that time, and I think that's right. I mean, Donald Trump is something of a creature of habit. He's something of a creature of comfort. A lot of these folks campaigned with him. To sort of slant quote from Nancy Pelosi, oftentimes there are guys who need jobs and jobs who need guys. It seems like he's dealing with the guys who need jobs first, finding spots for people with whom he is comfortable and who he wants to have in his ear all the time as president again.
So what are you hearing? What can you report? Who else needs a job that Donald Trump might be looking at?
Well, switching to the jobs who need guys part of it, I think the key thing to look at is how many more members of Congress can he afford to take? The House is going to have a very narrow majority. So, too, is the Senate. That could leave a lot of these Trump loyalists who've been with him for a long time on the outside looking in. Earlier today, we saw Eric Schmidt, the Missouri senator, former AG of Missouri, take his name out of the running for a cabinet position. I wouldn't be surprised if there are more of those that follow, in part because my sources in the Trump transition have indicated that he doesn't necessarily want to stack the cabinet with lawmakers. He's going to be looking outside. So we might be hearing some new names, folks who are not necessarily from the political set, to fill out some of these bigger jobs perhaps in the next few days.
Julia, I think potentially a new name for people outside Washington might be Tom Homan, who is someone who worked in the first administration. But for folks who don't know him, who is he?
Yeah, he was the acting ICE director under the first Trump administration. In fact, he was there during family separations, and he's defended that policy. He said that, of course, they expected that separating parents from their children would deter migration, and he's defended it. He will now be in charge of this mass deportation force. We should point out that as acting ICE director, he was never Senate confirmed, and now he will not be put up before the Senate. So the kind of scrutiny you might get with cabinet level positions, he won't be in that spotlight. Also, bringing him in closer to the White House will allow him to have direct access to Trump and to Stephen Miller, and to continue to push these policies that are very close to the president for deportations. And he won't have to deal with things like CISA or FEMA, other things the DHS secretary will have. He won't have to answer to as many people, go through regulatory processes, and he could do things like work with the State Department to try to expedite deportations in a way that he would be more stymied if he were the head of of a different department.
And he's going to report directly to Trump, we've been told.
Yes, okay.
And I do want to ask you about the how of it all. I mean, has he given any insight on what mass deportation might look like, how he might execute that?
He has. I mean, he's basically said, as you had at the top of the show, that this is going to be about criminals. It's also going to be about the people who have recently arrived. But when we talk to people who are close to Homan, close to Trump, they say, look, no one is exempt. That means families. That means taking away a lot of the protections that the Biden administration put around vulnerable populations. There were certain areas where you couldn't arrest people, like courthouses and places of worship. A lot of that might go out the window. We've also learned that the legal pathways that the Biden administration set up through parole programs for people from Cuba, Haiti, Nicaragua, and Venezuela, as well as the CBP-1 app that allows them to make asylum appointments in northern Mexico. That's all gone. And the people who came in legally, believing they had a legal pathway into this country, could now be eligible for deportation in a Trump administration. It's a way they're going to try to boost those numbers because, as we've heard from soon-to-be Deputy White House Chief of Staff Stephen Miller, they think that they could deport 1 million a year. Of course, the logistics, the funding still has yet to be determined.
Garrett, I want to turn to Elise Stefanik, now chosen, will be the nominee for United Nations ambassador. Obviously an ardent supporter of former President-elect Trump now. How does she figure into that as the UN ambassador? She doesn't have a diplomatic background.
No. In fact, also not a big fan of the UN is Elise Stefanik. I mean, look, I think this is a little bit of Trump kind of giving the finger to the foreign policy establishment to a certain extent. Maybe that's a bit too strong, but this is him saying we're going to have my style here as we deal with the rest of the world. Trump's never been a fan of the UN. He's not a fan of any multilateral foreign institutions. He likes the U.S. to deal directly with its allies and with its adversaries. Stefanik, for example, is a very big supporter of Israel, who's also butts heads with the UN from time to time. And so I think this is very much a message to the UN that sort of the kinder, gentler world of world diplomacy is on the outs when Trump comes back to Washington.
So one of the other names that sort of pops up every few hours, it seems like, is Elon Musk.
Yeah.
Right? He keeps coming back. How does he figure into the transition at this point and potentially into the new administration? It's
a great question and one that we're constantly endeavoring to answer because Elon Musk, as best that I can tell, has hardly left Mar-a-Lago since Election Day. He has been spotted there repeatedly. He is Trump's ear. He's been described as an informal advisor and a friend to Trump. Obviously, he has a wide variety of his own interests, which are sometimes in line with Trump's, but not always. I mean, Elon Musk is also one of the biggest proponents of solar power on the planet, if not just in this country. That's not necessarily something where he's in line with Donald Trump. So, best I could tell, he's offering some advice. He's, involving himself in some of these decisions, but I've been told he has no specific formal role yet, and he may not. I mean, you want to talk about somebody with conflicts of interest. This is someone who became a billionaire in large part because of the government contracts of SpaceX and the subsidies that Tesla gets. So he's in a very complex position here, but certainly close to Trump. And I'll just add, Trump puts sort of a premium on fellow billionaires. Yeah. He sees them as peers. He's going to listen to their advice, often above and beyond that of even his own paid staff. And I think that applies with Musk as well. To that end, do you have a sense of sort of who else is hanging around Mar-a-Lago? What other people are either interested in positions or interested in having some degree of influence? Look, it's always a similar cast of characters. I mean, the Mar-a-Lago membership and the people who've been longtime Trump friends are still tend to be down there. I'm interested to hear what somebody like Ike Perlmutter has been doing. He's the former chairman of Marvel. He's a longtime Trump friend, another of these billionaire guys who's there. I mean, it's also how people like Howard Lutnick got into the circle, or Steve Witkoff, for that matter, who's now going to be part of the team leading the inauguration. I think if I had one group of people on this planet I wish I were better sourced with, it's Mar-a-Lago members, because they're going to know a lot about what's going on in the Trump transition and White House long before the rest of us do over the next month. Julia, you also reported that Trump may be trying to deport thousands of migrants that President Biden allowed into the country legally. Walk us through some of your reporting that who are these migrants? Yeah, so these are the ones who came in from Cuba, Haiti, Nicaragua, and Venezuela. This was a program that Biden set up to decrease the number of migrants coming across the border illegally. And 30,000 per month, basically for the last 2 years, have been allowed to come in from those 4 countries collectively. The reason they sought out those countries in the first place, Aaron, is because they're very hard to deport to. They don't historically take back their nationals from the United States because of our diplomatic relationships with them. So
this was a way to try to legalize those people, allow them to work. If this is taken away from them, they then could be in a place where they're deported. Again, the Trump administration is going to have to figure out where to deport them. Are they going to try to put pressure on these countries through diplomatic channels or through tariffs? I mean, it's really hard to figure out exactly where they would send them. They could also look at third-party countries, like sending people who aren't from Mexico or Guatemala, for example, back to those countries. It also includes people who got asylum appointments. If they're not on the path for asylum yet, they could be looking at deportation.
Garrett, I'll end with you here. We have this Oval Office meeting coming on Wednesday between the president-elect and the sitting president. Obviously, no love between these two men through the course of the campaign, and they've not said nice things about each other. What do you anticipate we might see with Donald Trump visiting Joe Biden?
If past his prologue, I actually think the tone will be respectful. Whether that's sincere or not, it's not for me to say. But when then incoming President Donald Trump, President-elect Trump, met with Barack Obama, he described the meeting very warmly afterwards, talked about the idea that they were supposed to meet for 20 minutes. They met for 90. Even afterwards, Trump referred to some of the sort of lessons that Barack Obama had told him about what to expect from the world when he took over as president. I am optimistic we will see a similar version of Trump, at least while he is in the confines of the Oval Office and at the White House on Wednesday.
Yeah, we'll be watching the body language, too, to see what that tells us. Garrett and Julia, thank you both. I want to turn to Ken Delanian now, talk a little bit more about Kash Patel. Ken, help us understand who he is and how he fits into this.
Aaron, Kash Patel is probably the purest expression of MAGA conspiracy theories about the national security and law enforcement state in human form that there is. So he sort of came to the fore as a staffer for the House Intelligence Committee on the Republican side when they were fighting the Mueller investigation. And then he was hired in a Department of Defense role in the first Trump administration. And Donald Trump actually tried to make him deputy CIA director, but Gina Haspel, the CIA director at the time, threatened to resign if that happened. And so Trump didn't go through with it. But now he has sort of been waging war against what he calls the deep state. He wrote a memoir called Government Gangsters. And he is arguing, as are many in Trump world, that there are criminal elements inside the FBI and the national security state, the CIA, that are waging war on Donald Trump and his allies, that are doing illegal things. They must be investigated. They must be rooted out. So the idea of him atop of either the FBI or the CIA is very frightening to a lot of the career employees who are inside and just promises to be incredibly, incredibly disruptive there.
So, Ken, I'd like to know, what are you looking at when it comes to some of the key posts that are being filled in the administration at this point?
Well, just that, in terms of the world that I cover, the Department of Justice and the FBI, and then to a lesser extent the intelligence community, there's a big gap between someone like Kash Patel and a more traditional Republican like, say, Mike Rogers, who ran unsuccessfully for the Senate in Michigan, who's a Donald Trump supporter. He's a former FBI agent. He was chairman of the Republican, of the House Intelligence Committee under the Republicans in a more normal era. So he's MAGA, he's a Trump guy, but he would be greeted, I think, inside the FBI as a sort of a normal FBI director. Kash Patel, that's another story. Same thing over at the Justice Department. There are people now who are under consideration for Attorney General. There's a man named Mark Paoletta who's been advocating that Donald Trump can order the DOJ to investigate particular people. That would violate 5 decades of post-Watergate norms. That would be one thing. And then there are other people like, for example, Matt Whitaker, who was acting Attorney General before, who would be seen as less disruptive, less threatening. So we're going to learn a lot about the direction of the second Trump presidency by looking at the people that he appoints to these very crucial roles. And his aides have said that for example, who he appoints as Attorney General is his most important priority.
So, Ken, before I let you go, very quickly, there's been this reporting from NBC News that the Justice Department is going to focus on some January 6th cases between now and Inauguration Day. Very quickly, what do we know about those efforts at the DOJ?
Yeah, what the reporting is, Aaron, is that they will stop investigating people who simply illegally entered the Capitol and only focus on the worst cases, the people who committed violence against police officers, because there are hundreds of those people who are on video who still haven't been prosecuted. And there's a real fear that as soon as Donald Trump takes office, that whole investigation is going to go away. He's already promised to pardon some of the people who have been convicted. So there's a lot of concern inside the DOJ that there are very many people who are going to get away with having assaulted law enforcement officers simply because the clock ran out. Donald Trump came in and stopped the investigation. Now, whether he actually pardons people who've been convicted of assaulting officers and who are on video doing that, that's another thing. It's one thing to promise it, it's another thing to do it. But whatever happens, it's pretty much the consensus is that the steam will be taken out of what's left of the January 6th criminal investigation.